exactly is research? And we could talk about it at great length. I don't want to do that here today. This is designed to be just a quick overview, but a couple things about research. I would define it this way. It's an effort to learn that's intentional, focused, structured and disciplined, personally engaged, communal, broad-based, accountable, well-reasoned, and purpose-directed. That's a long list of things, and each one of those, again, is worth some discussion. We won't do it all here, but it's not just discovering by accident. It's an intentional process. It's focused on particular topics as opposed to wandering around, and that's part of what we develop is the skill of narrowing our focus. It's structured. Personally engaged, again, is this idea that when I research something, it becomes mine. I take interest in it, and I take ownership in the conclusions I reach. It's communal. Research is something that, though you may do it individually or you may do it as part of a group assignment, when it's done well, it contributes to the wider understanding, both of your class and of the larger community in which we live. And so research is a communal kind of a thing. Accountable, we'll talk about a little bit later, and purpose-directed. Good research has always got a goal in mind. And when we understand that, it helps to motivate us. It's not just some task I have to do to get a grade or pass a course. It has an actual purpose that it leads towards, and that really helps to make it meaningful. It is also, for us as Christians, something that ought to be biblically anchored. So there ought to be a strong sense of the role of Scripture and what God has to say through His Word to us. It should be Spirit-led, and of course it should be Christ-like. So some of the things about what research should be. How to do it successfully. Again, there are a couple of other longer and more detailed sessions in our orientation that talk about research and paper writing and so on, and my job today is not to duplicate all of that. It's just to hit some very specific things about research. But so I'd encourage you to take full advantage of those other kinds of seminars. But a couple general things. Good research has at least these qualities. Good research is aware of your assumptions. So you know what you're assuming as you come into the research in the first place. It has a clear purpose. I've talked about that before. It has a defined and limited scope. It doesn't try to answer everything or solve every problem. You're not going to solve every problem. In fact, when you come to the end of your seminary study, year after year, graduates will tell us, oh, you know, I've got more questions now than I started with. To which I usually try to respond with, yeah, but hopefully they're not the same questions, and hopefully they're questions a further step down the path. But you can never answer everything in any one research project, so you're always having to limit the scope, and that's okay. It follows a plan. It uses an appropriate number of resources and sources from an appropriate level. The other sessions will talk more about that. It uses the best sources for your project. They'll talk about that as well. Good research acknowledges and documents its sources clearly, and we'll come back to that later in this session. One of the goals of this session is to talk about research and then that big bad P word, plagiarism, and how good research gets me out of the problem of plagiarism, which is not a good thing. So it documents and acknowledges sources well, and it interprets sources accurately and carefully. It sifts its sources, so it makes wise choices about what it's using. Good research allows you to draw your own conclusions. That ultimately is the goal. Good, data-supported, intelligent, helpful conclusions that are really yours, not just somebody else's. And it presents all this stuff effectively so that others can be persuaded and helped and informed by what you've discovered. And of course, again, as Christians, it's conscious that God is involved and He's present and He's leading and He's our Lord in the midst of it all. And so we're seeking to be Christ-like in our research. A couple of words of practical advice, and again, without replicating everything in the other seminars. First of all, some things about research design. When you do a research paper or project, usually there's a certain number of things that you will include in that project, even though it might be in different classes and on different topics. And so these are some of the things you typically hit. And I just want to mention them, and I want to remind us of why they're important. The first is that research design almost always starts with a good question. You have to have a right topic, and that topic is almost always defined by a question. One of my favorite profs when I was in seminary, and the fellow who was the mentor for my thesis, used to start every class we took with him with a 1-hour lecture on how to write a research paper, which we're not going to do here at Carey, but he did, and it was actually really good when I was in the program. And every lecture began with this affirmation: you need to ask a good question. And that question then defines the boundaries on your study, and it gives it purpose and all the rest of it. And can I say, what's really important, I think, for Carey students is that you make it your question. Sometimes a prof will give you freedom to ask your own question, and then you have to come up with one. Sometimes a prof will say, here's a question I want you to research. But even when they do that, the more you're able to make the question your own. Why would I ask this? Where would I ask this? What does this question mean to me? The more the question is yours, the more the research project will be yours, the more the conclusion will be yours, the more everything will work well. So it starts with a really good question. One of the things that follows on the question is that you have to analyze. People will often come to a question and go, okay, I know this is the thing I want to learn in my research, but I don't know where to begin. I don't really have any idea what I have to cover. How do I get traction? And part of getting traction is a little process we call analysis. And people sometimes critique analysis as being Western and clinical and all the rest, but it's really helpful. And basically analysis is just asking, what questions do I need to answer in order to answer my main question? Pretty much every question you ask could be broken down into other smaller questions. And if you have a good sense of what those other questions are, then you know where to go in your research and how to get the answer to your main question. And actually, everything else on a research project tends to unfold out of good question asking and good analysis. And again, this is where making it your question will help you to know what things you need to know to get your answer for your context. And they may not be the same as what some other author or some other source looks at in order for them to answer what looks like the same question. Different people may come to the same question for different reasons. They may have different contexts behind it, and they may analyze it differently. You make it yours in your analysis process. You need to know something about the possible answers to the question, and that's part of research. We go to the sources and try to find out. If I have this question, are there whole camps or traditions or views that are out there in the literature or out there in the wider world that try to answer that question? I need to know what those are. It's part of doing my research, it's part of thinking the issue through well. Be very careful not to treat this as a kind of a multiple choice approach to research. Here's my question, there's these three possible answers, I pick B. While it is helpful to be aware of where the options are, the truth may be that the best answer for you is a combination of A and C. And you don't know that by just sort of looking at a couple of options and picking among them. The purpose for identifying options is not so that you make research simple and quick. It's so that you get some sense of where the question could go. And sometimes you'll also have to consider the other possible answers to the question that nobody else has written about. So don't be afraid of doing that in your research. That leads me to a really quite important point for us at the graduate level when we're doing research is it's not enough just to find out what the options are that are out there. Often people think, okay, if I can find 3 or 4 published possible responses to my question, I've done the research. No, you've done the preliminary research. The actual research that you need to do has to go beyond that. You need to ask yourself, what information do I need in order to decide which of those options is right? And that information may include looking at the people who've written about those things, but it needs to go beyond. You need to ask for yourself, what other things might I need to know? What are the things available to me that I could dig into and try to get to know better that will help me to decide what the right answer is to my question? And that's really where research comes to its own. It's finding out what resources you need to get your answer to your question, where those other options in the literature are helps to you, but they're not solutions in and of themselves. So find your own resources. You're going to have to sift your resources. If you're trying to deal with a question and you've got 20 books and articles and things that you're looking at that are going to help you with it, you have to decide which are going to be the most helpful and which are the least, which are the most authoritative, most well-respected, most insightful, most productive, and which ones are maybe kind of helpful but not so much. And that, again, is one of the things that our research seminars will talk about more. So sifting your data, or sifting your sources, I should say. That leads to a really important point, and I don't know how much this will come up in the other seminars, so I'm going to say it here. Be careful to distinguish sources from content. Sources from content. Sources, the books we read, the articles we look at, if we're doing literature research or other interviews we have with people, the person you interview is a source. The book you read is a source. But in that book are facts, concepts, arguments that are content. And at the end of the day, who says those things, what package they come in, what basket passes them to you, is not as important as the actual content. Your conclusion to your question needs to be based not just on whether you can find sources that speak to the issue or what the sources say, but what the content in those sources lead you to. So be really careful to distinguish substance, data, argumentation, concepts, content inside the sources from the sources themselves. Sometimes, on some issues, 20 sources have the wrong data, and one source has the right data, and that one source with the right information is the thing that you need to pay most attention to in your question. That's not usually the case, because usually if there's a good answer, more people will see it. Point is, sources are not the same as the substantive information that should inform your conclusion. Make sure you know the difference. This will become important when we talk about plagiarism later. Finally, at the end of gathering up this information from various sources that pertains to your question, your process is one of evaluating the options, deciding which option or options you think are most valid, most supported by the evidence, drawing the best conclusion you can, making it your conclusion. And again, especially here at the graduate level, the goal is not for you to tell us what you think we want to hear as profs. It's not to tell us what your favorite source said. It's to give us the best case you can for the right answer as you understand it. That's our goal. Our goal is to help you to be a good researcher and a good presenter of an argument in favor of what you think is the right answer. So you try to draw that conclusion, find a way to think about its implications and to present it effectively. These are the key pieces in research, and these are the things you're going to talk about more in the research seminars. Embrace them. Embrace them. Papers, other research assignments are opportunities to discover and to refine skills of your own, to learn some things that you might not otherwise learn, and to become really sharp in the ability to ask good questions, to find good information, to draw good answers, to communicate it to others, which is an important part of ministry. So embrace that aspect of research.